Hi everyone, my name's Sarah Gordon
Hi everyone, my name is Annie Clark.
and we're going to share with you some hints and tips on how to structure your online training. So Annie, just to start with, how do you structure your online training? Just to throw the question straight at you.
So it really varies. So where we had a one-day training session that a client has asked us to sort of morph into an online program, it does vary, but I tend to find that we're running or developing sessions so that there's some really great attention-grabbing pre-learning before the session. We would then have normally about an hour and a half of a webinar, then some self-directed learning, whether that's getting them to complete something or practice something or to have a conversation. And then we would have another 1.5 hour session, and then we might have a final check-in with them, or perhaps some more homework. So that tends to be how we would structure taking a one-day course to an online program, but also we might have some online modules sort of peppered throughout that as well, so that they can do that in their own time. And then with other sessions, it really varies in terms of how much we want to be able to get through. And I think one thing that I'm finding is that I still need to be quite realistic about how much I can cover in the time frame. So we've been running sessions recently, and we just had about probably about 30% too much content in that session. And on the previous video, I was talking about 3 to 5 minutes there should be some level of interaction, and if you cram in too much content, it really takes out from your ability to make sure that the session's interactive. So it's really important to make sure you're giving people value for money and you're giving them really great content. That what people are benefiting from at the moment, I think, is that sense of community and that sense of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. So
Sarah,
is that something there where actually kind of fostering that discussion, which obviously needs to be really well controlled by the host, but still so that people can share ideas, is that an integral part to your training courses?
100%. That's what it was like when we did face to face. I want to make sure that we still bring those same training values. And I think that level of interaction and that level of discussion is really important in terms of making people feel inclusive, which I think is vital at the moment. So we would use techniques such as using people's names and unmuting people so that they can still contribute. And where it's bigger groups, we would use breakouts as well so that they can learn from each other.
Yeah, so I think that's a case where, for me, that difference between face-to-face and online is in face-to-face training. It's really easy to put people into a little breakout groups and say, discuss this for the next 7 minutes, or here's your challenge type thing. Whereas when you're online, you have to facilitate that discussion. And you absolutely can't say, does anybody have any thoughts on X? Because then you're going to get a few seconds of silence, and then 3 people will unmute themselves at once and all speak and it's just chaos. And so I think that's something where actually saying, okay, I'm going to ask what people's thoughts are, and Annie, I'm going to come to you first, so if you'd like to find your unmute button now, just to reiterate, remind you of the question, it was blah blah blah, at which point in time you're now ready to say, okay, this is my contribution. And then you can see everybody else put up their hands or whatever the case might be. So you can structure that discussion. Yeah. Is that how you tend to run it?
Yeah, it is. I think one thing that I picked up from you a couple of weeks ago was that difference between visual and verbal cues. So like you're saying, it's really important to let people know when you're going to come to them. So what I tend to do is, because we use Zoom, is I'll have the participant list open, and at the start of the session I'll say, this is the order that we're going to go in, if it's a small group of sort of 5 or 6, so then people know the order that you're going to come to them in, and as you say, that they're prepared and they can unmute themselves.
Yeah, I think that giving people the heads up, especially if it's a quieter person as well who wants a bit more time to consider what they might say. So predetermining that order, or saying we're going to go, if you've got people from multiple geographies, almost say, right, we're going around the world, east to west.
Yeah, you did that the other day. Lovely.
Exactly. And it makes it easier. Yeah, you're thinking, what is the time zone difference between But it makes it easier for you as the facilitator as well, because then you kind of make sure you haven't missed anybody, especially because, for example, in Zoom, of course, as soon as somebody raises their hands, like their little blue hand, they tend to pop to the top of the participant list. And so sometimes it's like, this is great that everybody wants to participate, but I've totally forgotten
Yeah.
what the
One
order was.
thing that we're going to do on another session is we're going to have a map of the UK, and that if you're working internationally, you could perhaps have a map of the world, and we're going to ask people to note where they're calling in from.
Yeah.
And so you could maybe go north to south, south to north, maybe if you wanted to create that divide. You could do
yeah,
that.
there's lots of pros and cons behind that one, isn't there, right?
Yeah.
But coming back to the structure, so I think I really like what you said about just dividing up the day. So as well, we tend to find, so some clients, for example, they still want to keep that day training course in a day, whereas others are they're more open to thinking, well, actually, we can take that learning and spread it out over a week, for example. And I think that's something which online training really lends itself well to, is the ability to say, okay, we're going to take some of the learning and put it into Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so then you actually almost enhance the learning because you're letting it sink into people's minds a little bit more. And that's something where I think if you've got people kind of trapped in front of a computer, 3 hours with a break in the middle is probably about the maximum amount of time that you kind of you want to have. And within that 3 hours, obviously having lots of interaction, etc. as well. So a whole mixture of different activities, along with the kind of the more webinar type lecturing sessions as well. So I think, you know, that kind of allowance of time. And then I 100% agree with you in terms of content. You cannot deliver as much content online as you can face to face. There's just no way. And that's in part because unless you're putting people into those breakout rooms, and even then it takes much longer for people to have a discussion. And
take the feedback as well, because you want to make sure that everybody feels that they've been able to contribute and share.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a big difference between being in a classroom and doing a poll, for example. Online, a poll is there's a big distance between you and someone clicking a button on some sort of poll. And so that's a case where, yes, there are lots of tools, and we're obviously going to come on to that later with regards to how do we get that interaction, etc. But yeah, I think being cognizant of the fact that, I don't know, probably, I mean, I think you mentioned 30% less in terms of the amount of content. I'd agree with that in terms of what you need to get rid of out of the actual face-to-face training. But the good thing is that you've now got the ability to put little videos online and that kind of take that learning that otherwise you'd have in the training course and take it to be background learning so that people can do it if they want to, which is obviously difficult if, you know, it's something that is core to the objectives of that particular course. But as you said, it's a different learning environment. And so some people are going to excel and thrive, and other people who would usually learn really well because they love that classroom environment are going to struggle. And it's just a different way of learning.
I think it is about bringing as much variety as you possibly can and relearning how to do that, because I've got all of my tricks and tips for doing that face to face, but I'm really having to think quite carefully and get that variety, so it's not just everybody writing in the chat box every 3 or 5 minutes, but different. They're really having to keep engaged because they don't know what's coming next. So a little bit of it is about keeping people on their toes when they're in an online session, because there are so many distractions. And one thing that we always do at the start of the session, and actually on our joining instructions, is ask people to turn off their emails, their messenger, any form of sort of social interaction, because it's very easy to get sort of sucked into something else.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, so keeping people on their toes is great. And I think the final thing that I would say, which I think it does come into the structure of the online session, is, well, 2 final things. Firstly, you have to be much more structured in online training than you might be in face-to-face training, because in face-to-face you can decide, oh help, this is the wrong training course for this particular group of participants. You know your material, so therefore you can actually almost shift sideways onto doing something slightly different. You can't do that in online training, or it's incredibly difficult to do that, just in terms of what you're trying to coordinate as a whole.
I think it feels quite clunky on the receiving end if you seeing the slides aren't matching up with what the facilitator is talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So I think you've got to be much more prepared for online training than you might have to, or you might have got away with perhaps in face-to-face training, which we of course would call dynamic training when we're making changes on the fly. But the second thing as well that I really enjoy is inviting people to do little cameo slots. So whilst with face-to-face training, it's just you as the trainer. Obviously, when you're online, there are going to be two of you anyway, but you can invite other people in to, rather than, you know, in the past, you might have explained somebody else's case study. You know, now you can get the guy who was the risk manager for the International Space Station or whatever, and he can be live and tell everybody, this is what it was like for me. And I think that that's awesome, because it's something that's really special, and you can only do that in online, or unless you're really, really lucky and that particular person happens to be traveling through your city that day. So I think that kind of brings an extra dynamic, and something that you can then build into the structure is having cameo performances, as it were, from different people, which is really cool.
Yeah. And just going back to your first point about having to be much more structured, I agree, because I would have a session plan for the day, and I have a session plan for the hour or hour and a half, but it's down to minutes rather than sort of 20 minutes, 30 minutes or 40 minutes. So there is that need to be quite precise with your timings.
Yeah, no, definitely. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Annie.
Thanks, Sarah.